After driving 15 hours straight from Tennessee to Texas after visiting family this summer, I can honestly say I don't know how the pioneers did it in the 1840s. Over 6 months, and half of them died along the way. Welcome to Rumble Book Club. I'm your host, Mike Hernandez, and let's get started. Today, we're going to take a look at an incredible but intense and at times horrifying book about the 1840s pioneers. Today, we're going to take a look at The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown. In this book, Daniel Brown details the specific account of Sarah Graves Fosdick, who was a young lady who was newlywed, and she left with her family on the Oregon Trail to head towards the Oregon-California split, and her family became a part of the Greater Donner Party group, which became doomed and famous due to them being trapped in the Sierras in the middle of the winter. Looking at the aesthetics, it's a very busy title, but you have kind of the crest of the Sierra Mountains here, this upward blue expanse of sky, and then you have this quote here that serves as the title, The Indifferent Stars Above, which is actually a bit from a piece of poetry that Brown references later in the book. It's a very ominous title. The first time I heard it, it sounded cold. It sounded very chilling, and I think it fits very much the subject matter of this book. Looking at the readability, Daniel Brown speaks very much in the same pattern as another author I've reviewed before, John Boesnecker, in which he can concentrate a lot of information and throw it your way at one time. For instance, on a single page, you can run into more than a dozen different names, a dozen different dates, and then a dozen different little tidbits and idioms about those individuals that are mentioned. So there are points in the book, especially the setup before a certain embarkment, that you might feel like you're drinking from the fire hose. So you're getting a lot of information. A lot of times it's hard to retain some of that information, but a lot of the points he's trying to tell about these individuals are definitely driven home. And there are times that your eyes are literally glued to the page in shock and horror. And so the readability can be taxing on the mind, but on the eyes, in the very least, it's quite easy. You have cream-colored pages, very clear font, and it's easy on the eyes, even if at times it's not easy on the mind. So as far as the readability goes, it's going to get a relatively strong score of 7 out of 10. Now let's look at the content, in which Daniel Brown really focuses on the life of Sarah Graves, who became Sarah Graves Fosdick when she married this young violinist who she was in love with in Illinois. That's where she grew up. It was a relatively peaceful place, but it had its share of problems in Illinois. As you can imagine, the Illinois winter on the plains could be very taxing. There were other detriments about living there that made life very rough. Constant sickness, forms of malaria due to the fact that they were near a water source that could at times become stagnant. And so her father was looking for a better life, and he read about it in the form of this new opportunity out west, which was at the time part of Mexico, called California, and there was also Oregon right above it. Little did he know there was a particular book that printed on that subject matter that everyone was using as their guide to head out west for new opportunity, but it was going to change their lives forever. For some of them, it was going to be the cause of the end of their lives, the brutal end at times, and it was a little book called The Immigrant's Guide to California and Oregon by Lansford Hastings. Hastings was the original sleazy salesman. He had financial incentives to get people to go a certain route that cut away from the original Oregon Trail that we all played the little game of. Hastings saw some things that were accurate, and then he saw some things that only his delusion or greed could have led him to believe. So the things he saw that were accurate were the opportunity in California, the opportunity in Oregon, but particularly California. That was his baby. He was right about certain bits of information on how to travel, but there was a particular cutoff, the Hastings cutoff, that broke away from the Oregon Trail and cut through the Sierra Mountains, whereas the original Oregon Trail went for more or less over it. Cutting across the Utah flats, salt flats, and then the Sierra Mountains might have seemed like a quicker way that would have saved about 200 or so miles. But when you think about bringing wagons and cattle and horses and entire families, this trip was suicide, because you're going across large expanses where no resources could sustain the oxygen that needed to feed. That's your engine right there. And then you talk about weaving up and down hills, rocky mountains that make passing with such a large convoy of beasts and wagons literally impossible. But they didn't know this, and only Lansford Hastings really knew the truth but because he had been through that trail himself, he had taken it himself, but he had taken it without wagons, without oxen. He had gone horseback, and even then it had nearly killed him. But he insisted, because of his own financial incentives, to get people to go to certain stops that would financially enrich him, to cut across and go to California instead of going to Oregon over the Sierras. So Sarah and her newlywed husband and her family, they picked up all their roots in Illinois, and they moved across the country on this Oregon Trail to follow this guide written by Lansford Hastings and pursue a better life out there in California. Now, there was a crucial piece of information that Hastings was very accurate in when he wrote this book, and that was, if you're going to leave, if you're going to embark on this journey out west, you cannot leave later than May 1st. May 1st is the absolute cutoff, because by the time you get to those Sierra Mountains, it has to be well before winter, because your navigation through them is going to require there to not be a certain amount of snowfall. There can't be that much snowfall, and being in the Sierras in the heart of winter is suicide. And he knew that, and so despite his greed and his delusion that this was a worthwhile cutoff, he was accurate in the timing of when you should leave. The date that Sarah and her family actually left to embark on this journey was right around May 17th. On this journey, you learn about the general harshness of the trail, how hard it is to actually sustain a large company of people while you're constantly having to travel, the fact that you're constantly chopping wood, boiling water, trying to keep kids from dying on the trail. I'm sure anyone that played the Oregon Trail, all you millennials out there, you remember, this person fell and broke their leg, and now you died. And then this person got bit by a snake, and now you died. This person got run over by a wagon, now you died. That's literally based on actual events that happened to this party that was of families that was moving across. And when they got to this great split, which is known today as the parting of the ways, it broke off to where the Oregon Trail went north. The traditional trail went north, kind of over the Sierra Mountains, and then the Donner Party's trail, the one that had the proposed Hastings cutoff, was going to cut through and go more southwest through the Sierras, through the Utah Salt Flats even before that. So they had their work cut out for them. And you learn about just the overall harshness of life, especially from the time of that cutoff. The first real trouble that they ran into, where they understood that life was really going to beat them down on this quote-unquote shortcut, was really the Salt Flats, where you have this vast expanse of no real grass to feed your oxen, and your oxen are the engine that are going to propel you forward. So if your oxen die, you're stuck. You have all this material and no way to get it across the flats other than to pack it on your back. There's also a lack of usable water. So there were points where you had this steaming, putrid water that you couldn't use, and yet in their desperation to find water, some of them were drinking it anyway and getting violently ill along with the animals. In addition to this, you also had Native Indians that were picking off their cattle, and some of the healthy cattle that were already there, they were taking it away along with horses. So their resources that were going to sustain them through this winter in the Sierras were being depleted before they even got there. Then there comes just the difficulty of the terrain itself, going up these steeper and steeper hills, these winding roads where some of the wagons kept constantly braking and kind of delaying their process. So the fact that they already left late was made even worse, was exacerbated by the fact that they were being slowed down by the rocky pass that was constantly breaking their wagons, deteriorating the state of their oxen, and fraying their own tempers. At one point, a man was murdered by James Reed in the process. By the time they made it through all these Rockies, they made it to the base of the Sierra Mountains at a place called Alder Creek, where some of them camped at Alder Creek, some of them camped nearby, about a mile, maybe 2 miles down the trail, known as Truckee Lake. This site became known as a point where more horror than you could possibly imagine happened. By the time they reached this point, this water point, it was already frozen over. The lake was frozen over, the creek was frozen over, and it was already deeply snowing. They had made it here much too late. It was already the heart of winter, and they could not go any further. This is a site where they became trapped, and their resources slowly dwindled to absolutely nothing. At one point, a group, including Sarah and her husband and her father, along with multiple others, became known as the Snowshoe Party, in which they broke apart pieces of the wagon, created rawhide leather, tied up and created snowshoes, and began what they knew was a do-or-die mission to go through the Sierras, finish the trip, get to California, and call for aid. That way, more supplies could come over the other side of the mountain and rescue them. But by this point, they were already so depleted in energy. They had zero body fat left that could help sustain them for moments without food, and there was little supplies that they could actually pack to begin with. As both parties, the snowshoe party traveling over the Sierras, and then the rest of the Donner Party was trapped here at Truckee Lake, both sides were undergoing periods of severe hypothermia, severe starvation and destitution, and both of them individually came to their own decisions at the absolute breaking point through delirium, through the twisted morality that happens when you're in a survival situation, to actually begin to feast on the flesh of those that died before them. Cannibalism is the flash word that pops into your head whenever you think of the Donner Party, and while Brown does write extensively on that subject, he doesn't make that the obsession of the book, but he does detail what it takes from these individuals with their shaken morality, with their delirium through hypothermia, what steps they took in order to consume the dead around them. And it's very disturbing to read. It's very hard to understand how you stop seeing another human as a human, start seeing them as a consumable, as a food, how you strip them of their humanity. And for those of you that have squeamish stomachs, skip past this part, but in this book, Brown talks about the removal of the hands, feet, and head in order to dehumanize them and to see the body itself, the carcass, is more of a piece of meat. And it's hard to read. It's really hard to read because you understand that these are humans. These are humans that were suffering, that were pushed to the brink of what their mind was capable of enduring. And the fact that even while this is happening, while they're consuming another human being, while they're cutting up another human being, they're still trying desperately to retain their humanity. They're trying to care for the children that are suffering through this. They're thinking of their families, for those in the snowshoe party that were cannibalizing themselves. They're thinking of saving their siblings, their mothers, or their brothers, their fathers. It's a hard thing to read, and it makes for a very horrifying experience when you read through this. And for those that made it through the Sierras, that were able to get help, for those that were eventually rescued, it ended up being maybe 47% of the actual party. So more than half of them didn't even perish. And to that statistic, the majority of the people that survived were women. And you kind of understand that when it comes to survival without resources in the cold, women are actually uniquely adept at surviving, surpassing that of men, particularly because of the additional muscle mass of men. Our bodies use up the calories a lot faster, which depletes our natural energy a lot quicker. So in a desperate survival situation in the cold where you're battling hypothermia and starvation, it's actually women that turn out to be at an advantage. But nonetheless, I mean, this book really takes your heart and it shatters it when you learn about the loss of humanity of these people. As far as the content goes, it is very insightful. It's horrifying. It's too many words to really describe in a single video, but nonetheless, as far as the content goes, it gets a perfect score. 10 out of 10. This book was a gift from my friend. He actually bought 2 copies by accident, but he got it on Amazon. You can find it too, and I would highly recommend it, even for people who are squeamish. I think it's important to face stuff like this, to face realities of the human condition, and realities of what happens when you lose a piece of that humanity within yourself due to desperation, due to lack of moralities, or whatever it is. So I would highly recommend it. And if you are an adult, this is not a book for children at all in any way whatsoever. But go out and get yourself a copy on Amazon. The book is The Indifferent Stars Above by James Brown. Thanks for watching, everybody, and go read something.